Chapter 37, the 20th century Neo-Evangelicalism. You'll remember we're now in the midst of our own century. We've been looking at liberalism and the theology of ambiguity. Now we look at something closer to home, because I suppose that most of you in the audience are evangelical yourself, though we trust that any neo-orthodox people or liberal people are more than welcome to listen to these lectures. We're very glad to have them, deal with them seriously, and if you ever think you detect fallacy in them and care to write to me, I would be very glad to not only receive your letter, but answer it, as long as you don't expect an answer by return mail. We're pretty busy and can't respond immediately, but I'll respond even if I have to say I don't know the answer. I'll try to get the answer from someone for you. But now, first of all, under this 20th century Neo-Evangelicalism, which we're considering, number one, remember the situation in the early church. Some thought man was well. Some thought fallen man was sick. Some thought fallen man was dead. Two, among Protestants, we still have the well liberals, perhaps 90%, as I said. We still have the sick evangelicals, perhaps 8%. We still have the dead Reformed, perhaps 2%. I've mentioned the 90% before, but you realize if Christendom is, in my opinion, constituted by a liberal majority, and I actually feel that the last 90% of a church is the kind of majority the liberals have, then of course there's only 10% left for conservatives, and I'm estimating that the evangelical Arminian is a much larger group than the Calvinist, and if so, it would mean that the Calvinist is only a small 2% of professing Christendom in the estimate of this particular Calvinist you're listening to right now. I remind you once again, he's by no means inspired. I can't die for them. I'm not sure they're true. These are just educated guesses. I'm not totally ignorant of the ecclesiastical scene, but there's no such thing as anybody being on top of all of these figures. I have my own fairly close experiences with some and know this country fairly well and so on, and my general feel and the cues I get from people who do compute the statistics and write more precisely about the subject is that the overwhelming majority are the Pelagians of the early church, the Socinians of the Reformation period, the liberals of our own time that the Roman Catholics tend to call modernists and so on. The 8% would be the semi-Pelagians of the early church. They would be the Arminians of the Reformation era, and they would be the liberal, I haven't mentioned this before, the Arminians are today almost always identified with the evangelicals. Usually when you see a book, it's not strange because, of course, the Calvinists are also evangelical. And I and people of my persuasion are very happily to be called evangelical. But if this estimate is at all right, if the Arminians do predominate in the conservative non-liberal group, then you know that when the word evangelical is used for both groups, most of the time that it's used, it would be in reference to the Arminian. So we can actually virtually say that in the early church, the term for this type of Christian was semi-Pelagian. At the time of Reformation, it became the Arminian. And in the 20th century, they're usually identified with the term evangelical, though we who belong to the ultimate minority there are pleased to be called and justified in being called, I think, evangelical. But that would be the pattern as it looks to me in the 20th century of church history. Number 5, it is the neo-evangelicals we'll note especially in this handout. How do the evangelicals make man out to be sick when the Bible they know to be inspired calls men dead in Ephesians 2:1? They try to justify the word dead for their idea of almost dead. I won't mention the name of this particular man, though there's absolutely nobody in the world who wouldn't recognize it. He's probably the most famous evangelical of all. I remember reading in one of his books there how he was trying to explain his view of man as fallen. And he used this word dead repeatedly. And he indicated the fact that he needs to be reborn even. And the Holy Spirit has to do this work. This particular discussion went on for about 10 pages in this book. And after I read all this type of statement and saw alongside of it, it depends upon you. You must respond to the work of the Holy Spirit. It's your faith that brings about the regeneration. You realize that all of these statements, mostly taken right out of texts and so on, were denatured by the way in which it was actually understood. And well, if you stopped at, say, a certain page, you'd swear this man believed that people were absolutely spiritually dead. They had no life in them at all. They couldn't possibly respond to an evangelistic appeal. And so on. You would think this man is a Calvinist among Calvinists and so on. But before you get finished, the overall discussion, you realize this dead man has some life lurking in him. And you realize that the need to be reborn by the Holy Spirit is nevertheless something that's in your hand. The impression is given that you could prevent it if you want it. You can certainly bring it on if you want it. So you realize that what's happening here is that this kind of language, which sounds Calvinistic and so on, let's put it this way. Here's a Calvinistic bracket of texts and speeches and so on. Now here's the Arminian. Now you know these two are incompatible. And you know full well if this man's going to think the thing through, one of these things is going to predominate. You know full well he can't be at all an intelligent person and call himself a Calminian and say that you can have both of these principles. That just shows he doesn't understand either one if it's that case. You realize if you know the whether you know the man or not, when he gets down to it, he's going to have to pick. He's going to have to decide. He's going to have to reveal, even if he's unaware of the tension and the strain and the incompatibility, it's going to have to come out some way if the man has any consistency in his mind at all, whether it's this or that predominates. And it comes out very clearly that it's this. And then you realize, well, why in the world did he say all these things? How come he can affirm those? Well, he's using the word dead, but he doesn't mean dead. He means almost dead, very close to death and so on. You say, well, there's a difference between dead and being... Yes, I know. And so does he. But he's not being careful in his teaching there. This is the way it happens time and time again. This is part of the reason you can't get through to Arminian. When you'll say some things like this, we believe that. We believe that. And believing in the inspiration of the Bible, they're going to believe every text and so on. Then you go over and you say, well, look, if you believe that, how can you affirm that? If you really understand and affirm this, how can you say that? And then they squirm. You know, I've been in the classroom for 30 years and so on, where I can deal one-on-one with students and so on. They can't escape me. They have to be there, and they have to answer the question. And boy, oh boy, you should see them sweat. They know where I'm coming. They know what I'm driving at. They sense it, but they don't want to say it. And I'm not forcing them to say it, and they know full well their grade doesn't depend on their saying what Gerstner hopes they will say or something like that. I grade students on the work they do, not the conclusions they come to, and so on. But when they realize they can't say dead and sick at the same time, they are two different concepts, and they know very well if once they know he's really dead, then of course election comes in and priority of regeneration to faith and the divine initiative. We can't escape it. They don't want to say that. They want to avoid the package and so on. But there's Gerstner looking at them in the eye, word after word, expression after expression being considered and so on. They'll usually admit under that kind of close scrutiny, and not because I threaten them, and ask any of my students, they never ever feared that I would punish them because they disagreed with me or anything like that, but that I did want them to be serious thinkers. After a while, they just couldn't go on acting as if they were rational human beings and hanging in there with a manifest inconsistency. but you don't very often. Now, as I say, I do that in the classroom. I couldn't do it in the living room. I could see an Arminian sitting across the way, holding forth and so on, and I might be able to get a question in. And on rare occasions, I remember one time at a dinner in Washington there with one of the best theologians in the country, everybody became silent. And they let us talk back and forth for 2 hours. It had to do with segregation, actually. It wasn't a theological principle, but it was segregation. But it's very rarely. Usually conversation goes on all around the place. Everybody's right to as much time as he wishes. No one has a monopoly, but in this case, but very rarely, you see, this type of thing has to be thrashed out. Really one-on-one, very, very close and so on. And the classroom's about the only place where you can do it. And as I say, you see an awful lot of reluctance. All this is just an effort to try to explain why this difference, or why don't Arminians see that they're Arminians and see that they're not believing certain other things they say. For reasons like this. Number 6, why is it so important to the modern evangelical that man be considered sick rather than spiritually dead? Why does he hang in there on that? In spite of the biblical language, in spite of much of his own teaching, why does he still hang on to that particular error? Because if man is sick, he and the evangelist, with the help of the Holy Spirit, can save him. If he were dead, only the Holy Spirit could resurrect him. The evangelical thinks he would be out of a job. Now, I'm kidding about the latter point. I don't think he's worried about unemployment and not being able to get an income and so on. But the work which he is doing as a preacher and an evangelist, in his mind, her mind, depends on this particular type of theology. He's out to save people. And if they can't be saved by his efforts, why does he go on with it? He sees no answer to that. If this is entirely in the hands of God. I remember Dr. Chafer, I don't mind mentioning this because he's in print on this particular subject. The reason he opposed the limited design of the atonement that we discussed, you know, when we dealt with Tulip and so on. Dr. Chafer, Louis Ferry Chafer, the founder of Dallas Seminary, affirmed Tulip. I won't put them all down again. I don't have time, and you, I'm sure, remember everything I've said before, and so on. He insisted that he believed all of these except this one. And he wrote an essay on that, which in my judgment is the finest thing he has ever written theologically. I think it's wrong, but it's the most impressive performance I have read, and he has produced a standard work on dispensationalism, some 8 volumes thick, and so on. Now, here in this particular essay, which the Bibliotheca Sacra magazine republished several years ago, recognizing how important it was, I think, he is very humble and very modest and admitting that he differs with John Calvin. In my opinion, he differs with John Calvin on T, U, L, I, and P. But in his own opinion, he agrees with Calvin on T, U, I, and P, but he is conscious of differing on the limited atonement, and so he begins his essay admitting that he's out of line with the revered church father, with whom he basically agrees, and he's not at all cavalier about it. He knows it's a fairly presumptuous thing to disagree with the great Genevan in a matter of theology, but he differs humbly, and then he goes on to explain why he can't accept the idea of Christ dying for the elect and not for mankind, which is, of course, an integral part, not just of dispensationalism, but all Arminianism, modern evangelicalism. The reason he says in that article that I can't accept that doctrine is it would be the end of evangelism. Unless I can stand before an audience and say, Jesus Christ died for you, I can't preach. If I have to say, Christ died for you if you're elect, I'm going to go out of the business. That's all there is to it. It's all, he didn't say this, you understand. I don't know whether it's biblical or not, but I know it's evangelistic. I've just got to believe the atonement is universal and designed for everybody, and that Jesus Christ died for Judas Iscariot every much as he died for Peter or for any other Christian. I've got to believe that. But I'm just citing that as an illustration of what makes an Arminian tick on a point like that. Why does he hang in at the idea that he can actually generate his own faith and so on? And see, what's his name, Sperry Chafer, was out of line with this too, but he wasn't aware of that. But at this particular point, he was aware of it. If I can't say that Christ died for everybody and everybody has the power to respond to him, I just can't go on preaching. So the answer to the question, why don't Arminians see this point? Why are they so reluctant to admit it? Why do they keep getting hung up on it? Why can't our whole church that really believes the Bible back to back unite on what is the witness of the Bible? Why this hanging back? Why this determined resistance, this reluctance to conform? As I say, the fundamental reason illustrated in Louis Sperry Chafer's article, and I think typical of the whole group, is that evangelism is finished that way. You can't have real evangelism, and evangelism is necessary. What do I say to that? Do I say evangelism is dead? Do I say, too bad for evangelism, I'm going to go on being a Calvinistic preacher? Is the Reformed answer to this question, can't help that, we got to take it as it comes and so on? No, no, no. If this really prevented the carrying out of Great Commission of Jesus Christ, you'd know there's something wrong with it. If you couldn't become all things to all men, by all means win some, there's something wrong with that doctrine. So what's the answer to the question that bugs the Arminian? If this is true, and irresistible grace is a fact and so on, I can't be evangelistic. No, you can be evangelistic, but you do say the gospel is offered to everyone. If everyone comes and says to you, did Christ die for me? I can say, I don't know. I do know this. You're invited to come to Christ. You're commanded to come to Christ. You have no excuse for not coming to Christ. If you come to Christ, you'll most certainly be saved. Never hamstrung my evangelism. Never prevented me from inviting somebody to come to Jesus Christ. I've never found anything in Calvinism or never heard of anything in the Reformed faith that militates against evangelism. As a matter of fact, it's true evangelism, because except a man be born again, he can't see the kingdom. Unless he's born from above, he can't enter the kingdom. This is what I'm saying to people. I could speak with the tongue of men and angels that would do nothing for you unless Jesus Christ changes you over again. That's the only kind of true evangelism. It is not in our power to save people. God won't save people without our efforts, but our efforts is to introduce him to them, tell them the verities. The response is in their hands and in God's decrees and so on, but there's absolutely nothing contrary to evangelism that prevents anybody from a true evangelism. As a matter of fact, what Dr. Sperry is calling evangelism at that point, which drives him to oppose John Calvin at this point, is a spurious form of evangelism. We've already said, if men are dead in trespasses and sins, and they act in faith in Jesus Christ before they're born again, it's a work of the flesh. That's not real evangelism. And what one has to say to Dr. Sperry, if you operate on the principles you're operating on, nobody would ever be converted. There couldn't be any evangelism at all. But this is just by way of showing why it puzzles anybody, especially young people in the audience. Why do people hang on to these things and so on? In this particular case, they get it wrapped up with an indispensable notion such as evangelism, but they have a fluky idea of evangelism. They misunderstand the nature of it, and the first thing you know, they're holding on to a false doctrine because they have a false doctrine which leads them to it. Number 7, the evangelicals are not going to give God all the glory. They admit that the Father sends the Son and claim that the Son died to save everybody, and the Holy Spirit is willing to help everyone, but the sinner himself, with the evangelicals' help, must do what alone can save him, believe. Even God, unaided, cannot help him to hell. Cannot do it alone. Neither can the Creator God do it alone. Only sick man can decide the matter. On this term, Neo-Evangelicalism, which we're joining, let me explain that. See, there are many people who consider themselves evangelicals and are Arminians, who don't like the term neo-evangelical because they see it as a kind of compromise with liberalism and with churchism and such things as that. They may also be allergic to the word itself. In most cases, I'd say if you ever want to know what neo-anything means, just strike out the E, and you have what it actually is. Neo-orthodoxy is basically no orthodoxy. Neo-Thomism is no Thomism. Neo-evangelicalism is really no evangelicalism in the sense in which it's construed. But at the same time, I'm pointing out that whether you are an old evangelical who have nothing to do with persons who don't agree with you pretty much down the line and so on, or whether you're rather inclusive and cooperate with people who aren't quite as tightly committed to all the fundamentals of the faith as you are, whether you're a old-line evangelical or whether you are a new evangelical, this type of thing doesn't change. The fundamental underlying Arminianism is common to both. The term Calvinist belongs to Calvinists, and you'll have a neo-Calvinism I'm pointing to, but the neo-evangelical and the old-line evangelical is still Arminian. There's no basic change there, but in the 50s, this term neo-evangelical came in when the old evangelicals who had lived through the fundamentalist liberal debate and so on were understanding, talking about how they would get together. They found this difference among themselves, that some were holding tightly to certain principles that others were holding loosely to, that they felt were negotiable where the other group didn't think they were negotiable, and some rather harsh word was changed between this group, who would be called rather loose, and the other group, who would be called fighting fundamentalists or tighter or something like that. I think it's a significant part of the fundamentalist story in these United States. But what I'm saying at this particular point, looked at in the vista of church history, is this: there's no essential difference between the neo-evangelical and the traditional evangelical, in the sense that the underlying evangelical contrasted to Calvinism or Reformed theology is the same, namely Arminian, and it has the same repercussions in the world. Not to minimize that other debate, which is very important to the people in that debate. As something of an outsider, I'm saying there that the real issue is not fundamentally changed by that particular internal debate. 8. The evangelical even admits that the Holy Spirit does a regenerating of the sinner. That is a work of the Holy Spirit. It looks for a moment long enough to deceive many evangelicals, that they are giving full glory to the third member of the Trinity as well as the other two members. But right now, I think, remember from our last studies, that is not the case, and you can very well guess what's happening. That even when they affirm with great vigor it's the Holy Spirit who makes a person over again, he can't do it at all. What is it that makes the Holy Spirit do it? Yes, you're right. It's the same thing now that it was then. Namely, it is the person himself who, exercising faith, virtually obligates the Holy Spirit to do his work. The person can't do it, but he can make the Holy Spirit do it, which is indeed a compounding of the heresy. It's bad enough to think that the person can do it in the sense of bring it to pass. It's worse even to suppose that he can bring it to pass by literally commanding the Holy Spirit to do a job about which the Holy Spirit has considered himself up to that point sovereign. Number 8. Now, I guess I finished that. Number 9. Even though the evangelical Arminian admits the regeneration is the work of the Holy Spirit alone, it's the sinner alone who allows him to do it. Indeed, by his faith, obliges the Spirit to regenerate. Number 10. In the last analysis, though this concluding part of the 20th century is the period of evangelicalism's greatest seeming power and influence, Arminianism implicitly denies the glory not only of the Spirit, but of the Father, who is not allowed unconditionally to elect sinners, nor the Son to die specifically for those the Father gave him. Let me preface this remark here with the fact that I believe that these evangelicals are fellow Christians, and I consider them brothers in the Lord because of the elements of truth they have. But they have these elements of error which must be insisted on, and we must warn our brothers that if they understand these and hold these things in their own heart and so on, this is absolutely fatal to the Christian religion. But what I'm saying in this final point is that Arminian actually denies the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He denies the Trinity, or what we call the economic Trinity. He denies that the Father decrees salvation. No. According to the Arminian, the individual decrees his own salvation, and the Father simply ratifies that particular decision by him. So the Father is denied in his role in the economic Trinity. The Son does not save. Father does not decree. This is Arminianism now. Father does not decree salvation. The Son does not die for his people. He dies for mankind in general. He doesn't die for those whom the Father gives him. Either one of these, if you see it properly, an Arminian will deny. He'd be embarrassed to have somebody pointing out that he's denying the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and he's going to see if he can't somehow or other escape that onus. But at the same time, if the Father does indeed decree unconditionally, and if he makes a point, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, then the Arminian is denying the Father the role which the Father claims to perform. And if the Son came to die for those whom the Father gave him, and only for the elect, then the Arminian is denying the work of the Son. He's saying, Christ, you can't die just for a certain group of people. You have to die for everyone as we decree. And as far as the Holy Spirit is concerned, this is the most obvious of all. The Holy Spirit's sovereignty in regenerating is denied also. As we've said repeatedly there, if I exercise faith, the Holy Spirit must regenerate me. He has no sovereignty in the matter. The Father has no sovereignty, because if I exercise faith, he's got to accept me. The Son has no sovereignty, because if I believe on him, he has got to accept me. And the Holy Spirit has no sovereignty, because if I believe, he must regenerate me. That's Arminianism, plain and simple, and I think you know, if an Arminian was going to die for that, he certainly couldn't be dying for Jesus Christ. Our hope is that he doesn't mean what he says. I don't think he likes to have that as an option, but it's the only way I can see out of his sad dilemma.